that we, the taxpayer, are going to give the IMF $100 billion. Where's he going to get it? You know, oh, okay, that's right, we have a Federal Reserve. But he doesn't realize it. The Federal Reserve is on its last legs. Now, as important as 1207 is, and reforming and getting rid of the Fed is, the possibility of the Fed's just self-destructing is probably, there's a greater chance of that. That doesn't diminish the need for us to do what we're doing. But, you know, right now, even though we're getting a lot of co-sponsors, to go through a transition and first open up the books and study the books and review it, and then have a logical transition from the system we have to a gold standard, that's a pretty tough job. But nevertheless, it will end. There's a big difference between what we have now than what we had after the Civil War. During the Civil War, we went off the gold standard, and the gold prices soared up a couple $100. And then in 1875, with the Resumption Act, they announced, you know, we're going back on the gold standard. They quit printing greenbacks. They balanced the budgets. They started withdrawing some of the greenbacks. And lo and behold, the people actually believed their government back then, and that they wouldn't overspend. But today, you know, if we announced in Washington today that, okay, yes, we're going to balance the budget next year, we're going to take off all the pressure of on the Federal Reserve to monetize debt. I mean, how many people would believe that? Nobody would believe it. So that's why I anticipate that when we have to sort all this out, it's going to be quite possibly under dire circumstances. But regardless, you work for the transition, you work for the most peaceful, graceful transition that you can have. And I've talked about that a lot over the years, about where you could cut if you could get the political stamina to do that, and do it without necessarily hurting people. But I think it's going to happen a different way. I think just as they could not predict and they could not prevent the collapse of the financial house of cards, and it went quickly. And that is what happens to currencies. If you look at the history of currencies, currencies go quickly at the end. Although people know they're inflating, and the currency may be dropping and dropping and dropping, but when the confidence is gone in the system, it drops off. And as I said, since this dollar system is so huge and so worldwide, it is going to be a big event. Then the real challenge then is, you know, how much of our freedoms we have, how do we pick up the pieces, and that's what campaigning for liberty is all about. I'm convinced that we lost all our wealth, and we had the crisis, but we retained our liberty, and had a very, very small government, a government that guaranteed property rights and contract rights, guaranteed that the money could not be counterfeited, and that there would be no IRS, and there would be incentives. I would be all back on our feet within a short period of time. A good test of this, a lot of times I've asked the question, now, if you'd have happened to have been the president, what would you have done? Well, I couldn't have done too much at all unless we convinced the Congress what to do, but this is what I'd have asked them to do. And that would be that instead of passing all these bailout packages and all those appropriations, all that inflation and more deficits, I would say, let's just do one thing. It's going to reduce the amount of income to the government, but we're going to have to cut spending as well. But what I would have done is just immediately repeal the income tax and let of what we spent, so wouldn't it have made a lot lot more sense to have the money in the hands of the people who would have the incentive to go out and work. But instead, what are they doing? They're raising taxes, regulating the economy, inflating the currency, running up these deficits. And of course, the place where I have always suggested to be the first place to cut spending and come back to our senses would be the overseas spending. What do? We have this $100 billion. It's going to go to the IMF. Have we cut the military like we were supposed to get? No. The military, the first thing was asked by the president was to increase the military budget by 10%. Oh, sure, we were going to bring all the troops home. Well, as soon as things get settled in Iraq, I think maybe a couple dozen will come home. They're going to be there, I believe, because the chaos and the violence is escalating. But more troops in Afghanistan and invading and bombing Pakistan, and that was the peace candidate? Oh, man. So nothing is being cut. Now, I think the Senate just yesterday passed the supplemental, but the supplemental, the president asked for $84 billion, yes, $84 billion for the supplemental war budget. We weren't supposed to have a supplemental war budget anymore, but we did. And then by the time it came to the House, the Democrats in the House added $12 billion. So it went up to $95 billion. I think the Senate passed a little less. It'll go to conference. But it was a closed rule, which means, you know, that the fiscal conservatives didn't have a chance to amend it. And the talk went on, and the Republicans were just condemning those Democrats for spending all this money, and this was just terrible what they were doing. But the Republicans had one amendment, that is the recommittal amendment. Send it back to committee, they have one chance to amend the bill. And they asked to increase it by $3 billion. And you know, you wonder where they're coming from. But it also demonstrates so clearly why we're in such a mess. But let me tell you, you're way ahead of the Congress. The people are ahead of the Congress. And it takes them a long time to catch up. I've always thought that the Congress was way behind the people on this war on drugs. I have been convinced that I always thought, well, if the people weren't way ahead, I would have never been reelected to Congress a long time ago. Because I had been out for 12 years and went back in 96. And they knew by that exactly what my position on the war on drugs was. And that is that the war on drugs is worthless. It's a war on the people. It's a war on our liberty. I have a Bible Belt district, very, very conservative, very religious, and people detest drugs, as I do. I think the use of drugs are horrible. Even as a physician, I think most of the drugs that doctors prescribe are horrible.